Hi, ladies. Welcome to chapter 4 of The Wounded Heart. This chapter is called The War Zone, Strategies for Abuse. Allender starts out by saying that sexual abuse exacts a terrible price in the victim's life. We have talked about shame, we've talked about contempt, we've talked about denial. He talks about how the sins of the perpetrator, the dark, malicious acts of the perpetrator, the shameful acts of the perpetrator, color the victim's life because we see an inability to enjoy relationship, an inability to relax into intimacy, and a loss of hope. A lot of times we see that the victim's soul feels bound to denial. The heart often feels wounded and alone. When we feel a sense of longing for more or even delighting in what is available, we often shy away from that and it feels dangerous to us. And so a lot of times it feels better to just live without passion or without a hunger for more or even without a sense of pain because we learn to turn that off too. This ache cannot be acknowledged. It's hard to put a name on it. It's hard to aptly describe it to people who wouldn't understand, but we also can't completely silence it because it lives within us like a silent scream that makes life extremely difficult and uncomfortable. So the question becomes, how do we enter the chambers of the wounded heart? How do we go within and heal what has been hiding there? And it begins with getting a good grasp on the internal pain so that we can really understand how abuse occurs and what it does to the perspective of the victim. So in this chapter, we talk about the stages of abuse. Now, this is very generalized. It's not going to be the same for every person, but Allender talks about how in his work, he did notice there's a common process involved in many cases of abuse, whether that's perpetrated by a relative or a known non-family member. Usually there is a strategy, even if it's not written out on paper. Usually the steps kind of seem to follow the same stages. The details will differ in every case because each person is uniquely abused. But in order for us to understand what is really happening here, we can recognize that there are going to be exceptions to the rule, but that these same typical patterns play out and affect victims in many times similar ways. In most cases, sexual abuse does not occur out of the blue. It does not often occur suddenly or by someone who lurks in the bushes and waits for someone to walk into his lair. Only 11% of all sexual abuse is perpetrated by a stranger. The majority is actually in relation with a family member, 29%. Or with someone else who is not in the family but is known by the victim, which accounts for 60% of cases. All abuse is a violation of the sanctity and wholeness of the human soul. But when sexual abuse is perpetrated by a member of one's family or by someone who you trusted, the loss is even more severe. Sexual abuse is always a violation of relationship. It always damages the soul to some degree. And it will be influenced by factors such as level of severity, nature of the relationship, the number of times it happened, the age of the victim. But we have to understand, regardless of any of these circumstances, violation is violation. And the context could vary from person to person. So, for example, a stranger giving a sneering or leering look could feel dangerous, but less damaging than intercourse with a family member. But if that same look came from a father, even without any physical contact, it will bear harm to the victim, possibly more so than having experienced that same look from a stranger. Sexual abuse is an event or a series of related events that occur in a context, and the context is an important part of understanding the first stage, because not many victims of abuse come from happy, quote, normal homes, even if it appears that way to an outsider. A lot of times a home where abuse occurs is relationally distant and empty. Legitimate, healthy intimacy is often rare or non-existent in these kinds of homes, and it is a breeding ground for deep soul hunger. A lot of times if you ask an abuse victim what happened in their home or what their home was like, they may say that it seemed typical or it seemed normal. But two factors that are essential to a happy home were often absent in the victim's home life. The first is a sense of being enjoyed for who one is rather than what one does. So just being celebrated for being here and being alive, you're precious, you're a gift. A lot of abuse victims were actually enjoyed and praised, but for what they did or what they offered, especially being the adultified child, the parentified child. This kind of appreciation leaves the hungry heart untouched, as Allender says, because you learn that you have to earn approval rather than just receive it for being here. A second factor that is often missing from an abused child's home is the respect of one's being that permits the opportunity to develop uniqueness, and separateness from other members of the family. So a lot of times we will witness dynamics in the family that are not healthy, often codependent, or like we said earlier, parentified or adultified. It is typical for the abused daughter to be singled out, often even before the abuse occurs, as one who is expected to function as a little adult. She may be expected to do shopping or cooking or handle family finances. She may take care of her parents or her siblings. The author gives a few examples in this chapter that have varying degrees of severity. So if that is something that you want to look into, there are examples here. But the role distortion takes away a child's childhood and replaces it with adult burdens that are way too heavy to lift. But the child must lift them if he or she is going to enjoy any benefits of life or love within this dysfunctional home. So forsaking a childhood begins the process of giving up the soul, because you learn to accept breadcrumbs of life and of love and of happiness. So the role confusion is further complicated if the child's boundaries and individual rights are frequently violated. So boundaries being appropriate lines that separate your inner and outer world from the domain of others, they give you a sense of uniqueness. They give you a sense of independence and orient to who you are in contrast with who others are and what the world is going to see you as. A common boundary is the right to privacy, especially while performing hygienic practices. And many abused individuals were never granted privacy of space, let alone privacy in their thoughts or feelings. So the author talks here about how being walked in by family members while showering implies quietly that your body is not your own. And he gives several examples here also. So we have hundreds of choices every day that give us a sense of ownership over our body and over our being. And these choices require a sense of separateness and individuality that begins with an idea of what is rightfully ours and what is reasonable for others to expect of us. And a person who has been abused will find it difficult to comprehend the boundary issues that a lot of us take for granted because they've been a normal thing. The right to decide what we wear, the right to decide where we worship, whether we can say no to a request, simple things like using our voice or what we eat. A lot of times these small boundary violations can chip away and someone doesn't notice how painful they are until they look back and realize, I learned that no was not a complete sentence from a young age. I learned to let other people sway my decisions from a young age, so no wonder it was easy for me to be manipulated in this way. Other boundary violations occur when a parent tells a child her feelings are wrong, crazy, or non-existent. For example, you're not afraid of going to school. Are you crazy? No normal kid is scared of going to school. You're not afraid. And this will cause the child to question her perception, and costing her tuition will become dangerous to her because she's been told that she was wrong. So this home that we've been speaking of here, this context we've been building, creates a relational hunger within the child because there's a sense of being needed, but people are demeaning to us at the same time. So we're unable to trust our perceptions. We're unable to trust our feelings. The atmosphere is demanding and rule-bound, and the highest family value is often loyalty. Always faithful, no matter what. Protect the family from attack and shame. So this puts a hook into the child's psyche a lot of times that family is safety here. Other people are going to be a threat. We don't let them in. And this can translate in abusive situations to nobody will love you but me. If you tell anyone what goes on in this home, I will die or you will lose all opportunity to find love. You won't be believed. People will hate you, doubt you, blame you for hurting your parents. A lot of times these are underlying messages. They may not be spoken clearly, but the rule of quiet and loyalty is assumed and infused into the family psyche. So this really sets the scene for abuse because the child is empty, alone, committed to pleasing, doesn't understand boundaries. They're overburdened. They're bound to a family or a parent whose desire becomes like hope for the hungry child. The key words that he talks about here are empty and dependent, because the child is dependent on the parent's physical provisions for life. They can't provide for themselves, but they're also psychologically intertwined in the push and pull of the parent's offer or refusal to provide nurturing and support. So this person, this child, has learned at a very young age how to survive, how to maximize pleasure, how to minimize pain through trial and error experiments. Many factors influence personality, but the organizing theme in a dysfunctional family will be for this child to form the personality of learning how to deaden the pain of soul hunger while remaining sufficiently alert and predisposed to act in one's own best interest. So when the heart becomes dulled to its own pain in order to survive, the child becomes often hypervigilant, poised alertness. In order to live in this contradiction, the child has to develop a split between two or even more positions existing as different people at different times. You have the inner person who quietly stores what is precious away from the sight of a dangerous world, and then a public person who adopts the manner and the dress and the voice and the face that people expect you to have. And this can even go further in the family in terms of, if dad expects me to be a good student, then I will perform to his desire, and the reward will be what it is. Maybe he'll smile at me, maybe he'll be happy with me. And in cases of abuse, maybe it will be a night free from him sneaking in my room late at night. Again, there are several examples here in this book to varying degrees of severity. I will let you look into that, but ultimately the child is caught in a dilemma because survival, especially as mammals, requires fitting in. And to fit in a household like this means to live a life of torment. Allender says, the experience of being profoundly used and let down by someone we trusted and relied on sears the hope that relationship can be purely enjoyed. So the trust that we place in our own family member or pastor or neighbor or teacher or old friend, this trust was used by the abuser to gain an uninformed, naive, and innocent compliance from the victim. So this compliance falsely implicates her as a willing participant in her own demise. We're a child. We're trusting. We can't be blamed for what happened here. We were put in a predicament that no child should have to go through. So with all of that being said about the context of sexual abuse that must be understood, we also have the typical sequence of stages here. Number 1, the development of intimacy and secrecy. Number 2, the enjoyment of physical touch that appears appropriate. Number 3, sexual abuse proper, which could be physical contact or psychological interaction. And number 4, maintenance of the abuse and the shameful secret through threats and or privileges. So again, there are exceptions. A child could be forced upon by another person without having any kind of setup or seduction happening. But even if this occurs, there will likely be a stage 4 involved to keep the child quiet. So looking at stage 1, the development of intimacy and secrecy. This first stage can be considered a conscious, intentional setup that opens the refrigerator doors to the sight and taste of the hungry child. So the details of the abuse often indicate that the perpetrator began this setup months and even years before any physical abuse occurred. Even in cases that involved severe physical attack here, the perpetrator often pursued an intimate relationship with the victim prior to the assault. The essence of stage 1 is often the offer of relationship, of intimacy, of special privilege, and of rewards. We're looking at children here, so this can be viewed as the offer of water to a person dying of thirst. Again, there are some stories here that I will let you read in your own time, but stage 1 sets the hook, because you have a child who has often grown up in a household that has deprived them of any kind of closeness and human intimacy, not in a sexual way, but I'm appreciated, I'm valued. So what's happening here is the abuser knows that this child is missing something. Something has been withheld from this child's heart. And so he offers what he or she can to gain trust and access to the heart. After years of neglect, a child might be suspicious, but the suspicion is hiding a desire for involvement with another person. She craves to be wanted to some degree, even if it deprives her of her dignity. This is not something that can be helped. So a lot of times the first gift or the first bit of warmth and intimacy that is offered, whether that be a ride in a boat, a new comic book, the privilege of staying up late, these barriers are dropped and they give the child anticipation and desire like dangling bait in front of a fish. This gift is often followed by no expectations or demand other than secrecy. So don't tell anyone else about this because they might be jealous. So secrecy, at least at first, is confined to the privileges of intimacy, and it deepens the special relationship that is beginning. So the victim tastes a bit of grace, a free gift of life with no obligation to perform. Someone is just being nice to them. And this will lead to increased hope and increased hunger, a dropping of the defenses, and a responsiveness that brings the soul out into the light for the first time. And with a lot of children, it brings the first sense of femininity or masculinity in a new light. So this is something they often haven't experienced before. It leaves them with a desire for more, not knowing what it is that lies ahead. So stage 2, physical contact that appears appropriate. So logically, this follows the introduction of relational intimacy and secretiveness, because during the first stage, physical touch may be present, like hand holding, back massages, scratching of the head, or hugs, but there will likely be a separation of time between the two stages. This could be minutes, this could be days, this could be years. So stage 2 comes in, and it's the beginning of a physical and sensual bonding. Notice I said sensual and not sexual. So this is not in any way, shape, or form sexual to the child, unless the child has been conditioned to interpret sexual contact as a legitimate expression of relational intimacy. So if the child has already grown up being treated that way, they may already have those kinds of expectations of this kind of touch. But what we are talking about in the more innocent sense, assuming this has not been done before, stage 2 first being introduced, we're talking about sensual. So physical touch through sense receptors that produce a response in the body that is pleasurable. So this could be a hug or a back rub. It feels good. We're not going to say, okay, that child clearly knew that something sexual is coming. This could be a child who didn't get hugs very often. Or maybe they got physical touch, but they got chastised also, and they learned that touch was pain, and now they're being touched in a way that's not demanding anything of them. Of course, this feels good. And so this could even be cuddling, this could be tickling, this could be playing together. But a relational touch invites the child to relax in the warm strength of another, something that they often haven't felt before. It's the equivalent to watering a flower that has been left without water for days, as Allender writes. He also talks about how this desensitizes a child over time so that they don't recognize the abusive progression of sensual becoming sexual. They become numb to the naughtiness of this because it started out not naughty, and they can trust this person. And so when it does start to intensify, they're often met with ambivalence instead of a strong no. Remember, they already have their boundaries blurred here because they never had them very strong to begin with. Whether touch occurred before or after physical abuse, so even if the perpetrator jumps straight to physical abuse and skips the tender touch and the sensual pleasure, the child may actually ask themselves, looking back, why did I allow myself to trust? Why did I allow myself to want someone who would abuse me in that way? And the question will persist even when the victim knows that there was no way to discern the intentions of the perpetrator. There are a few examples here in the book, but again, this is a child, and this stage 2 is a process of silencing the victim and at the same time sealing his or her fate. Because, for instance, to a 6-year-old, the difference between having their hair played with and being touched inappropriately is only a matter of degree. And if one is accepted and enjoyed, why not the other? For a 14-year-old, the difference may be clear. One is acceptable and the other is not. But an adolescent, no matter how sophisticated, will not look into this and get the same meaning to a sexual act as an adult would. The adolescent often will not see the touch as a choice as clearly as the adult might, especially if they have been locked in isolation for years. They've been hungry for contact. They've been unsure of their own right to boundaries. They've been doubtful of their own judgment. So this is a very dangerous phase, because after this comes stage 3, and that's when sexual abuse proper takes form. There are many different forms of this. It can come from many different sources. Allender states that it's dangerous to speak about this stage without certain cautions because there are clearly different levels of severity. The nature of the relationship, the degree of role closeness, like father versus neighbor, the degree of prior intimacy, the degree to which physical or psychological violence was used or threatened to be used, the short and long-term results of the abuse will vary by person. These cannot be put into an equation to say, okay, this is how badly this person was hurt. So we just have to recognize here that this could take many forms in a context always of emptiness, confusion, and loneliness. It's a context that sets the victim up for a baffling interplay of betrayal, ambivalence, and powerlessness as the adult moves the victim from one stage of abuse to the next. The initial stage 1 often feels like nourishment to the soul. Physical touch is offered in stage 2. The senses are intertwined with relationship and aliveness. To be alive is to feel passion. It's a blood-tingling, intoxicating passion that opens the door to a soul of a child who has never been appreciated in this way before. So then when we get to stage 3, it says that sexual abuse is the final blow that sabotages the soul in a climactic betrayal, mocking the enjoyment of relationship and pouring contempt on the thrill of passion. So Allender says the betrayal involves more than just relational sabotage. It is also intensely personal and physical, and that this is a very difficult concept to understand and accept, especially for those who have been abused. When a little boy or girl, adolescent, young man or woman is abused in an overt physical manner, he or she will often still experience sexual arousal. It is nearly impossible for the victim to not experience physical arousal when the primary or secondary sexual organs are touched. There are millions of nerve endings in certain areas of the body, more so than anywhere else except the taste buds of the tongue. So when you are being touched in a place where there are that many nerve endings, there will be a physical response. And many victims often feel ashamed of this because they can't understand why their body would respond that way, why their body would betray them in that way. They feel powerless to stop the abuse and their response to it. Sexual abuse will not be experienced every time abuse occurs, though, because sometimes fear will block out that arousal, and sometimes physical pain is introduced so that that arousal is impossible. It's also common for the victim to dissociate their thoughts and feelings from the physical experience so that they don't have the conscious arousal. So this could be an out-of-body experience or a self-induced hypnotic trance. This is basically what we refer to as dissociation or splitting. Human beings have the ability to separate or split off their feelings from their thoughts, or at times to even ignore the data that is being perceived by their senses so that their mind doesn't have to translate what they're sensing and put it into the context of familiar categories. So it's our mind's way of protecting us from things that we should not be having to go through. So also another note here, stage 3 does not have to involve physical violation because sexual abuse also includes psychological interactions that are deeply damaging. So there are a couple of examples here. If it doesn't go to touching, we will say that comments are enough, offers for sexual advances are enough. Anything that triggers emotions or some degree of what people might call sexual arousal or sexual curiosity, or exposes the child to something that they shouldn't be exposed to, this is going to cause ambivalence in the child because there's going to be hate and desire, pleasure and shame. And it's going to activate a strong desire to dissociate or separate these two opposing emotions because we're not meant to feel two opposing things at the same time like that. And so a chasm will be created in the soul between pleasure and rage. And sometimes those will be completely obliterated from the memory. There's also the rage of betrayal and the terror of losing relationship with the abuser and other members in the family. So we can't change the abuser. We often can't run away. The emotions are there. And so the safest thing we can do sometimes is to just not feel anything at all. Then we move to stage 4, which is maintenance of the abuse and secrecy. And this can be through threats and or privileges. This is very similar to the first stage where we're developing the intimacy and secrecy. Only now it's not going to be like love bombing anymore, because now it's going to be whatever leverage that can be found, because now the abuser has more to lose. A lot more has happened. So now there could be threats, there could be force, there could be coercion. The fear is usually based on physical or psychological threats or actual use of force, threats to harm the victim, harm someone dear to them. Psychological threats are equally powerful, however, and the silence is rarely broken. Few children or adolescents actually tell a parent, friend, or teacher about the abuse, and a lot of times it remains a dark secret for years, if not forever. The event could be a one-time occurrence, or it could continue over several years, and the silence and continued compliance intensifies the victim's resolve to deaden all feelings and find some way to endure and to survive the assault of his or her soul. There's an ambivalence that fluctuates between rage and pleasure until the internal warfare has so wounded the heart that it simply gives up the fight. Usually by that point, the abuse has ended or the victim has moved out of the home. A flight from this internal and external battle is the only relief that seems possible for the already devastated soul. So escaping to another life would require a new identity, a new history, a new burial for this past that didn't happen. Let's just not talk about it. Victims can also concoct an image of their past that was happy and normal, and this can become true in their mind. So a lot of times they don't even face what has happened because they don't remember it. But a lot of times the barriers that are put up, the blocks to vulnerability, the blocks to intimacy, rage that is barely concealed behind layers of self-contempt, these things find a way to peek out. And in order to heal from this, we have to kind of open that dam and let the raging water be discovered. And we have to look into it and understand it, understand what happened, understand the damage that was caused. And Allender says this is the way to understanding and healing the wounded heart. I will post journal prompts for this chapter in the chat. Again, I want to reiterate, if this brought up things for you that are too much, please do not continue to move forward unless you feel you are able to do so. I will also include a phone number that you can call in case of a crisis. It is a national crisis hotline. If you need further support, please reach out. You can email me or DM me at any time, and I will check back in throughout the course of this week as we move into the more tender parts of this book that people may find more painful. So thank you for being here, and that is chapter 4.